All right. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us on today's webinar. We are very excited to have a special guest that'll be joining us for a fireside chat today. Our webinar's title is Turning Insights to Impact, a Fireside Chat with Arianne Parisi. If you're not familiar with who Arianne is, she was previously at JD Group as her Chief Digital Officer, Global Chief Digital Officer. She is joining Kohl's as their Chief Digital Officer. I'm sure she's quite excited to be starting off in that new role. But we'd like to welcome you again and thank you again, Ariane, for spending this time with us and being able to share your experience and insights with this group.
Thanks, Harvey. Great to be here.
All right, so we do have a very simple agenda today. We're going to go through a quick introduction for the benefit of the folks who are not familiar with Quid. After that, we're going to jump right into the content that you're here for, which is our discussion with Ariane and talking about a number of different things from her own experiences as well as insights that would benefit you in your day-to-day roles. And then after that, we're going to go into our Q&A as well. So throughout the course of the webinar, if you have any questions, please feel free to use the Q&A widget. I'll take a look at those, and depending on whether or not we can insert them into the discussion, I'll try to do that. But otherwise, we have a dedicated block at the end of our webinar to be able to address these questions one by one. So for the folks who are not familiar with Quid and specifically around how we work with folks in retail and commerce, well, really at a high level, what we're able to do is not just extract insights from petabytes of data. That's more than a million, that's more than a billion, that's a significant universe of data. And being able to aggregate that and help folks not just to understand the insights from this data, but also what actions to take from them to ensure that you're staying one step ahead of your competition, whether that's in retail or other consumer goods companies that you may be working for. It's still relevant in terms of the types of benefits that you're able to derive from using us here at Quid. And we do know that there are so many different ways that folks are being influenced in the way that they make purchases, whether it's through influencers that they're seeing and scrolling through their social media channels, or whether it's family and friends. There are so many different opportunities for folks to not just interact, but take in new information to make decisions on what they're purchasing. And yet, somehow, this is still a massive blind spot for many folks that we're talking to, especially in commerce and retail, really understanding how these different signals and how these new missions that may be emerging through social channels and through product reviews are indicating that there's a new need, a new desire for their customers to identify products that meet these needs. And what's really interesting is when we hear these stories from folks who still have interns who are manually tracking trends on TikTok, which sounds incredibly painful and time consuming and inefficient, or that there are folks who are missing out on key trends that lead to them potentially missing out on a month's worth of revenue because of the fact that they were unable to capitalize on this trend in a timely fashion. And really, this is where Quid comes in. So, like I was alluding to earlier, not only do we extract insights, interpret all of these mountains of data, we also help to contextualize it and base our recommendations on your day-to-day needs. So whether you're trying to better understand how to optimize your landing or your home pages to ensure that you have the right products featured there, and this is for marketing teams, or understanding how to plan for future seasons and to have an understanding of what the emerging trends are now and having the flexibility to adjust, unlike what you'd get out of trend forecasting tools and services, and really understanding how you could focus and optimize your buys. These are different areas that we're able to help out in, and we leverage not just our data, but also our AI-driven tools as well as our subject matter experts. And I talked about data a lot, but you can just see here that we have a great sample that represents what we're pulling from to be able to extract these insights and make recommendations, whether it's consumer data, market data, where we do have patent and investment data, product and service reviews, and even your own data. So if you've got your own product listings or other customer data that you have that you want us to be able to ingest into our models, we could certainly aggregate that and build the model for it to ensure that the solutions that we're providing for you, that they're bespoke and very specific to your business needs. And we do realize that this process sounds incredibly complex, which it is. This illustration that you're looking at here is what we call our quid factory, where we ingest mountains and universes of data, right? Massive amounts of social posts, product reviews, whatever it is that you would like for us to be able to analyze, including your own customer data. And then being able to aggregate and leverage our internal tools and our expertise to be able to extract the insights that are relevant to you. And the way that we deliver these insights, it's based on what your needs are. So whether you're looking for Word documents, PDFs, PowerPoints, these are ways that we could deliver these recommendations to you. What we prefer and what we've found is most effective with a lot of folks is actually having dynamic interactive briefs that allow them to be able to drill down into this information so that you're not necessarily having to reach out to your analyst team or to reach out to one of us, one of our experts here at Quid to learn more about something that you may be seeing in some of these briefs. And we have that available through our Quid terminal, which we're quite excited about. And just to give you an example of what types of insights we're able to extract that we use for our recommendations, this is a quick look under the hood of some of the data that we do take a look at. We were able to aggregate and to group together trends that we're identifying, different narratives through all these different sources that we're ingesting to be able to identify certain attributes, whether it's a velvet or matte finish to lipstick or specific colors that could be relevant for a given season. These are things that we're able to uncover. And not only that, but also to be able to drill down into them just to see how important, how much of a priority it should be for you and your team. We're not just extracting and looking at the data holistically without giving you the right context. We're also helping you to understand which ones you should be acting on now. So here's an example of one of the briefs that we've been able to put together where we really wanted to emphasize the simplicity in which we're able to share the insights that we've extracted. And I realized the video here didn't start playing, but one of the things that I wanted to be able to highlight here as well is not only are we packaging and simplifying how we interpret these insights, but as this video scrolls down, you'll also see that we're making very specific recommendations based on these insights. So really what we want to be able to ensure for folks is that we're giving you as many at-bats as possible to be able to land multiple base hits and potentially a home run. So we're quite excited about these dynamic briefs. I know that a lot of folks have seen these and want to learn a lot more. And we do encourage you to reach out to us, your dedicated Quid contact, if you'd like to learn more about how we're able to deliver these insights through our Quid terminal as well as these dynamic briefs. But with that commercial out of the way, I'm going to go ahead and skip right to our discussion. And welcome back, Arian. Thank you so much again. Geez, I'm getting tripped up over here because I'm so excited, but I'm so glad that you were able to join us here today. And I do realize that you're quite busy and you have a lot going on right now. But what I want to be able to kick off with is for those of the folks who are on the call or on the webinar who are not familiar with you, your career, and your areas of focus. I'd love it if you could share with us just what your experience has been over the last couple of years and just give us a quick preview into a day in the life of Arian.
Absolutely. Thanks, Harvey. Well, again, it's great to be here. And I'll give a brief bio, but just to share, I've been in retail for about 20 years now. And my origin story really starts on the merchandising side of the business. So I worked in buying and planning those sides of the organization, which is really focused on physical product. And I was in at the Sports Authority, a national retailer. Back then when I started, I was at Nordstrom. So a lot of kind of national retail chains, as you mentioned in the intro, most recently at JD Sports, which is a global brand with over 4,500 stores globally and a real big kind of like youth culture focused brand, right? And then have stepped into the Kohl's Chief Digital Officer role very recently. So I'm looking forward to kind of learning more there and growing the business with that team. I think that my history with data, if you think about the functional areas in retail that I've supported, it's been quite broad, right? So when we think about the different types of data that I've utilized across the course of my career and the ways that I've been able to access that data consume it, synthesize it, derive insight, and then take action. That has been one of the most kind of transformative processes in retail in the multiple decades that I've been in the business. So embarrassingly, I go back to the times where we had, printed reports, totally static reports, nothing dynamic, nothing exploratory. And so they're the very analog beginnings.
Yeah.
And I think that the thing that I've observed over time is that obviously data becomes prolific, but it's really not significant until you can kind of stitch together a real picture. Today it's like you can have so much data and still be really insight poor,
Yeah.
and or maybe not understand how to take that insight to action. So the thing that I have always been seeking and wanted to understand is, if you think about data points around customer, around product, around market dynamics and behavior, around trend, there's almost all of these different kind of like parts of the ecosystem that you really want to correlate. And as a commercial leader, as a digital leader, very much of our role is kind of stitching this together to say, it could be as highly strategic as like, what is our market differentiator and where does our brand fit into the marketplace? What is our reason to exist? What's our value proposition? Or something as simple as you mentioned the velvet lip, which I love that example because beauty is a category I've worked in before, and it is so trend based, and there are those terms that can be very niche but very meaningful. But every single Monday we're living in the now, and we're thinking about how do we access and correlate these points that kind of tell us a greater picture, that allow us to piece together the story of what's going on. So my relationship to data, just both because of the evolution of retail and systems and technology, has transformed materially. And then I think over time, from merchandising into digital, has also transformed quite a bit. And the thing I'm really obsessed with today, and I love the conversation we're having just around like, how do you really drive to action, right? Because I think
Yeah.
that's the risk always is, again, you've got fragmentation of data sources. We've all got plenty of data references out there. How are you actually deriving meaning? How are you using the contextual insight to really understand what it means for you uniquely? And then how are you able to take that data and do something significant with it?
Right, right. And that point resonates quite a bit with me because we actually had a recent conversation with Forrester. We had a webinar with them, and one of the things that they highlighted was that roughly 54% of the folks who were part of their survey, while they may had mountains of insights, I like using the mountains analogy apparently today, but 54% of them didn't actually know what to do with that stuff. And so it's
Right,
really interesting.
right.
And I could understand how it could be incredibly overwhelming, right? You alluded to all the different data sets, and
Yeah.
you were talking about your Monday meeting where I know in previous conversations we were talking about how there are different groups that are sharing data and really interesting insights from what they're
Yeah.
analyzing. But the challenge is how do you connect the dots, right? How do you connect or put
Hmm.
together puzzle pieces to actually get the full picture? And from, you mentioned that you've been doing this for 2 decades. I'm curious from year one to today,
Hmm.
what 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 are some of the changes that you've been seeing, and how have you tried to adapt?
Mm,
I would imagine that this is something that you became much more exposed to as you worked your way up in seniority, where you were an individual
yeah.
contributor to now you are leading teams, and
Right.
the issue or the challenge is becoming much more pervasive, right? How have
Right.
you worked to solve that?
Yeah, I think you can look at it in a couple dimensions. I mean, there's the obvious of the evolution of business and retail itself and what that has then created in terms of the signals that you can collect and the insights you can have, right? So that's an obvious change for all of us. I think what I love about retail is that it's a team sport, meaning you've got all these different functional areas, and they kind of it's the mix of how those come together that really drives your outcome. And I think digital in particular, because it's so customer facing, most customers interact with the brand digitally before anything else and or with a high frequency. To me, it's the place where all of this information kind of comes together. So I think my observation as a digital leader, as someone whose teams are consuming data constantly, is I think just the proliferation of it has increased to an extent where the pace of how consumers move is accelerating, right? So everything is happening faster, trend cycles are happening faster. Our ability to consume that data exists more and better than it ever has. But I think where we've lagged then is just in the synthesis of that data, right? And how we kind of bring it together and drive to the so what. And just back to the point about retail being a team sport, um, I think that more than ever, organizations where you might have marketing overlapping with digital, overlapping with store merchandising, right? Like organizations are looking for unifying themes where they can all be aligned to a source of truth or an insight source that creates meaning for all of us to kind of move our teams toward an action, right? So I think it's the pace of available data and the pace of consumer trend and that acceleration, and then the need for, because of that pace, retailers to keep up, right, in an increasingly complex world.
Right.
That's really my biggest kind of observation.
Right. With your focus being on digital, I know that you're still working with other teams that are focused on
Hmm.
merchandising and even,
Hmm.
more of the in-person experience as well. How are you seeing your functions and, the way that you work operationally? How do you see that crossing over?
Mm.
And are you seeing,
Mm.
over the last couple of years, is there more overlap happening where, you were talking about everyone basically being on the same page and
Yeah,
capitalizing on the same types of trends, right? How have you guys worked in
right.
that respect?
Yeah. I think pace of change, pace of the shifting, like again, that accelerated consumer interest. Someone sees something on TikTok, it takes off like the consumer's attention span is just so much shorter, right? So all of this trend acceleration and that pace of change then in turn creates demand inside an organization for a higher level of coordination and a higher level of effort. And if you think about, in retail, our planning cycles, the buying cycle can be ages. The buying cycle can be nine
Yeah,
months before you've actually landed the product that you've either designed or committed to. So the buying cycle is long, but and previously then things like content production was long too, and there's just really no tolerance for that anymore. So whereas before you could have a planning schedule around your content, around your priorities, that really was a lot less dynamic, and it followed kind of just a really slower cadence.
yeah,
I think now the need for agility amongst teams is just far greater, and so that coordination and that agility, the only way to get that is to say, okay, well, what's our aligned source of truth? Obviously, you've got people and process to support that.
yeah,
But I think that the ability to kind of ingest those insights and turn them around into something that is very material that the consumer can see, right? Or that you can put your signals in the water to pull that consumer in.
right,
That's changing so much, right? And I think that is kind of the successful formula, is how do we align on that source of truth, agree that these insights are telling us that this is the story and this is the direction and this is the action to take, and then how can we kind of shorten the life cycle between when we have the insight, we know the action, how do we get it live to market, right?
right, right. Have you had any experiences around, you're talking about how quickly you need to act on things because consumer missions, consumer objectives, they all
Yep.
change so frequently as a result of things like TikTok. Are you seeing your team being able to influence more of the on-site merchandising, with the brick and mortar stores? I'm just curious about
Hmm.
how this access to insights and data, how that's changed
Mm,
your act, especially since you were talking about how
yeah.
buying something can get 9 months, right? And I know that they're relying on trend forecasting tools and getting sort of an editorial opinion on what may be trending 9 months from now.
Yeah. Yeah.
But a lot can happen
Yeah.
in 9 months, right? So yeah, how does that all
Right.
work?
Right. Well, I think it's dual. I think that, first of all, I'll just say I think brick and mortar retail is so hard. It's so difficult. And having grown up in retail and really driven a lot of those kind of outcomes to the store, the planning cycle, the allocation cycle, getting the right product in the right place at the right time, like all of that work I think sometimes gets undervalued, but that is really the heavy lifting of retail. And So those are processes that require conviction, and they do require buyers and strategists and leaders who can derive from the data points and the consumer insight that they have today a longer lead time vision, right? It's just the store timeline has to be a longer lead time. Otherwise, you create chaos, and operationally, it's just not effective to try to be as nimble. So I think it's dual, because I think that the stores require thoughtful, strategic planning and conviction with a layer of nimbleness, right? Where you can be agile and say, okay, are our visual merchandising guidelines flexible enough for store managers to be empowered to flex, right? Like, do we have the right signage that actually allows us to pivot? How is pricing affected, and all of that? How is inventory liquidated and prioritized? So I do think that it's a little bit more foundational, the nimbleness that's required for stores to effectively do it. Digital, obviously, the nimbleness and the agility, that's where you have to be able
Yeah.
to kind of, go to market differently. So I think there's some parallels and similarities, but I think that effectiveness in store requires really long-term vision and conviction around kind of the trend life cycles and what will come, in the future, so that you're not creating this operational chaos. And digital can play a little bit of a supporting or a leading role in that you can be more nimble there. You can kind of leverage that as an arm to catch trends faster. But I think that's where good insight and good data will tell you both things, right? It's like, well, what are we learning today? How fast are those trends moving? Is this something that's going to have a longer life cycle, and can we build it into our future process for stores, right? How sustainable is it versus this flash in the pan, and do we just go after it quickly
Right. Right.
digitally? So I think that's the thing I'd say just about the duality of it. And then I think that the most effective organizations, it's all about strategic alignment at the top. And, all of the organizations I've been a part of, there's something almost religious about that Monday morning commercial trade review, right?
Yeah.
And ideally within that, you have your buying and merchant teams, and you have your go-to-market leaders, both digitally and in stores. And that's where you can create kind of shared conviction around what's objectively working, what's objectively not working, and like what are the things that we're capable of doing to adjust or tweak that path.
Right.
So I think that's where the channel strategy has to be unified, and you need to have that conviction kind of across the group.
Yeah. Well, if you wouldn't mind us deep diving into that specific topic, but I was gonna joke about how you stole the question that I was gonna
Oh.
ask you. But if since we've been talking about more strategic
Hmm.
approaches, right, when it comes to commerce and retail, what does the tactical day-to-day look like? So you step into the office or you log online
Hmm.
Monday morning. What does that look like for you?
Yeah, I think it's fairly different depending on what
Or does
seat
it
you're
start
in,
Sunday
right? Yeah,
night?
I know, the Sunday night. It is the Sunday night, unfortunately. This is just the life we've chosen. Um, I think it's really different depending on what seat you're in, obviously, but it's a variation of the same, which is for the area I support. You're doing a simultaneous kind of look back on whatever time frame, and you're saying, okay, what happened? And the next phase is like, okay, what does it mean? And then what do I do with that information? And so I think we're at the start of the week, there's always this kind of like recentering around what do we learn from it, and what do we do about it, right? And sometimes that can be easy to just kind of report the news. I think the real effectiveness comes when you digest the news and you go, okay, here's what it means, and actually here's where we can take action.
Right,
But I would say that from a day in the life perspective, you always have one foot in the future and one foot in the present, right? You're always kind of planning for that future state and actioning against the current state. And the like the craziness is just like how much data and insight and all of that you consume, especially on those Mondays or the Sunday night, um, across all of those touch points, right? And I think those data points for me in my seat are typically, I'd say, on an ongoing basis, they're both quite tactical, right? They're relative to shorter term KPIs, and
yeah,
then also there are kind of the longer term views, right? There are market share reports. There's NPS, so I understand customer sentiment. There's brand love. So I'd say it's a simultaneously digesting all of that. and then trying to infer like, okay, well, what do we do with it, right? And I think the
Right.
interesting thing also is that short-term responsiveness can sometimes be detrimental to long-term health. So you got to balance, like, you know what I mean? Like, um, the decisions you're making across those different KPIs and those data sets that you receive.
Right, right. That totally makes sense. Um, Being conscious of time here, I've got two more questions that I think would be great and enlightening for the folks who are in attendance. But one of the one of the things that we talked about during one of our prep calls was this concept of finding the right balance between letting your customers drive your strategy and having, the feedback and the strategies that may be suggested from a consulting
Mm,
firm that you may be working with,
hmm
right? And
hmm
figuring out which one needs to be the tiebreaker in terms of the way that you all approach things. But can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah. Um, I think that philosophical and theoretical strategy can only get you so far. And I think that there's danger in allowing that to disconnect you from your true consumer sentiment.
Yeah.
And I think that you look back at retail history and it's littered with brands who kind of diverged from their core consumer or an understanding of kind of what their core needed. And that can sometimes be because another path is sexier and more appealing, right? Or it can be because the strategy sounds like it could create a really rich P&L, right? And so there's like a lot of reasons that strategy can can maybe become detached from true consumer insight and sentiment. And I think it requires a blend of both, which is that more broad business strategy and understanding kind of the market trends and kind of the things that every single retailer and brand will be susceptible to. So you have to be conscious of kind of I don't want to call them generic, but like the relevance of um, either behavioral or kind of like more general operational trends that are going to affect your business. And then I think like time and time again, the brands that have really succeeded are those that can dig down into a true understanding of who they serve, right? And at the core, like what motivates those customers and what do they care about? And how do you create a resonant long-term brand assortment go-to-market strategy that really creates and keeps an emotional connection to those
Yeah.
consumers, right? And
Yeah.
so there are so many opportunities for those feedback loops these days. And I think sometimes we kind of want to look away from it because like it's not always what we want to hear. So I think there's a place for both. I think history is littered with brands who diverged from what the customer was telling them or who they knew their core customer to be because of something shiny and different. And I think that that's where we have to think about long-term KPIs, true customer sentiment, and placing a valuation on the measurement of that when it may not always have a near term, easily kind of measurable material impact. Because
Yeah.
longer term KPIs like sentiment, we've done this work to say, okay, well, how much is it worth to have one more point of brand consideration? Like it's massive, right? But you don't see that play out necessarily on a short term basis. So I think it's having um, the conviction and almost like the guts to
Yeah.
hold true to that.
Right. And I think that also speaks to something that you said earlier, just about having alignment in terms of broader objectives with
Hmm
leadership and obviously how that filters down to the folks that
hmm
are executing, right? If you all have an understanding around expectations when you're looking at certain metrics, like whether it's sentiment or let's say share of voice within your space, right? It
Yeah.
may not have a direct impact today, but from a longer term perspective, that's when you start seeing some of the benefits. So thinking about longer term, a lot has changed over the last couple of years.
hmm
And I'm curious about what your take is on the next 5 to 10 years. What does the
mm
future of retail and
mm
commerce look like to you?
mm. Well, that's a huge question. Well, I mean, and I want to stay away from like the more generic tropes, right?
Yeah.
I think obviously we know that AI is transforming, generative AI is transforming everything. And I think that the way I see AI being the most transformative in the next 5 to 10 years is it's already disrupted everything operational, right? So
Yeah.
the no risk, low hanging fruit of how retailers are adopting AI in chatbots, in operational processes, even in development and engineering, like all of that is becoming a little bit table stakes. And I think we're moving into this phase where the customer facing impact of AI, and I would use like AI generated content. I think that the what we're going to see is an adoption curve that starts to accelerate and a almost like a consumer sentiment that where it becomes more accepted. I think people will start to see the benefits of that operationally on the business side. I think that we'll see that it can be quite aligned to brand and can accelerate, a lot of our activity. And I think consumers are becoming more and more comfortable with that. So I think from a content perspective, that is going to be prolific. And I think also the ways that consumers like begin their search, right? The findability of product and where that
Yeah.
happens, like outside of the retail ecosystem, outside of Google, if I can say that word. Um, I think like that is just transforming where are people starting their search, right? And where
Yeah.
is that kind of conversational process happening? And so that process will force us to think a lot more about our own data, the data enrichment against it, like how we show up and those ways of learning. And I think um to me that's I think what's on in kind of on the horizon. I think brick and mortar will continue to be relevant, and I think the retailers that have a really strong customer and value proposition will win. And I think in all channels. So I think we've reached really a good kind of homeostasis with understanding the omni-channel mindset and the interactivity of all of that. So I don't think there's anything disruptive in a new phase coming in that regard, but I do think it's like this kind of bifurcation of the retailers who are going to do it well and are going to continue to thrive, and we'll see that happening, and then those that kind of fall by the wayside because of the lack of relevance and operational excellence.
Right.
um
Right.
yeah, that feels a little meandering, but like those are a couple things that I'm
Yeah,
seeing
no,
come to
it's
life.
great just getting an inside look into your thought process. And I'm sure that we could talk for another hour or so because there are a couple of things that you mentioned there in your response where I was thinking about um, adoption and how privacy plays into that from a consumer
Mm,
perspective, right? Like how much more willing are we willing to give up information about ourselves for our
mm-hmm.
experiences to be personalized? And I feel like, I don't know about you, but I feel like I'm much more open to that and
Yeah,
letting people
yeah,
use my data to
right,
personalize my experiences. But I know and I recognize I'm not every person out there, and everyone
right.
has degrees of comfort with that. I want to make sure that we have some time to respond to some of the questions that have come in, but this has been incredibly insightful. I'll jump into Letty's question. During your time at JD Sports, what kinds of third-party sources did the company use for trend intelligence or for consumer insights? She's really curious about that. And what do you think worked well and what didn't?
Mm, great question. So I had a really unique seat in JD and the great pleasure of getting to be a part of kind of evolving and developing our consumer insights division. And I think sometimes this will live like in finance within strategy, sometimes in digital, sometimes in marketing, and same thing at JD. I'd say we have had so much rich insight from various parts of the organization. Customer care with NPS, like just this prolific amounts of information and data. The phase that I, was entered the global JD organization into, and then got the chance to kind of form and lead, was starting to get a little bit more of a consolidated view against all the diverse sources of information. So to answer the question more directly, we had banking data where we had banking data with analytics where we could examine that via dashboards. We had point of sale data globally, across Europe, across the US. We had more broad kind of like industry market share data. We had NPS data. We had brand love data. We had obviously all the other, transactional points, et cetera. So the goal that what I was trying to achieve at JD and what is in flight, and there's a team and a leader that's doing this, incredibly well and evolving it for the future, was like, what does true consumer insight mean, and how do you stitch it all together? So, to answer the question, our sources were so diverse. They were coming from different functional areas. We would sometimes get a report that would say our market share was this, and we'd have to dissect that and say, well, why doesn't it match to this other report that says this is our market share? And oh, who are the competitive, who's the competitive set within it? So I just think like it's the interpretation and the um, understanding of how to make sense of all that that really matters. And that was our ambition.
Yeah. Awesome. Thank you for answering that. All right, I've got another one here from Dave. This one's a little bit more tactical and specific to you and the way that you work with your team. But what's your approach to ensuring that your team members understand what you need when it comes to insights?
Mm. Um, yeah, I think there's a learning curve to this. And actually, this is one of the things I've tried to develop over my career is understanding what leaders uh, that I work for will value, right? And I think it's not just like what is the content of what you're sharing back, but how are you adapting that content to the particular seniority of the leader, right?
Yeah.
So I think about the granularity with which I expect our site merchandisers, for example, to understand their category business. So if you're a women's footwear category site merchandiser, I expect that you know all of the keywords that are trending and you understand like what our prioritization strategy is across all of that. But I really want to see that kind of like bubble up into an insight-based approach. By the time it gets to me in a Monday business review, I want to know, what is the so what, right? So what are we seeing trend across the business, and what's the so what? What are you doing about it? So I think the most important thing to me is always just like, well, okay, what are we doing that with that information, right? So great. I
Yeah.
want people to be. We all have to be. It's almost like I always thought about this as I was coming up in my career, and still the same thing today is the amount of data and information that you have behind you that you've ingested to be able to then say to your leader something concise, right? Is like, I've
Yeah.
already synthesized all of this, and here's the so what, and here's what I'm going to do about it. So I expect my teams to do that work. And then similarly, that's how I communicate to my peers or to my CEO, which is like, we have all of this data and insight. We've informed ourselves, we've synthesized it. Here's what we're doing, right?
Right. Right. I like to think that that's what Quid helps a lot of folks to be able to do is really synthesize that data and show exactly how you could take action on it. So,
Mm-hmm.
quick commercial there. I've got one more question
Mm-hmm.
here from the audience. It's from Sunny. Can you share an example of a recent insight that led to a significant business decision or strategy shift?
Mm-hmm. Well, this one's a little revealing, but it is material. So I'll edit it a little because some of it's like kind of a little more private information. But one of the things that JD is really focused on, and this is quite public in all of our earnings and in everything we've shared, is growth in the US, right? So
Yeah.
JD Sports originally a British brand, has incredibly rich history and heritage there, an almost 30% market share. And we all know breaking into the US is a whole nother thing. So where data became incredibly important and started to inform some of our marketing investment strategy. One of the questions that I got to kind of live through is, well, what's the right amount to spend in marketing when you're trying to build a business and you're trying to build
Yeah.
consumer awareness? Like, how do you actually, there's of course a range of what retailers spend or what brands spend to run a business, but to build awareness and to create consideration, what do you do with that? So as I was describing to you this insights division, one of the things we then tried to distill from that insight was a true view of our brand awareness and the consideration and that correlation between, okay, how much should we be spending in top of funnel if we want our market share, like kind of correlating all those points to say
Yeah.
this is maybe what we need to spend in brand marketing and what are the effective ways to spend that. So um, we made a pretty big decision to make an investment because of that, right? Knowing, and again, it's you ladder it all up. It's like, what is a strategic priority? It's to win in the U.S. What are the data points that you need to understand to say, are you winning, or are you not, or what might it take to do that, right? And then kind of driving that down into action and executing because of that. And I'm proud of the teams for that willingness and ability to examine it in that really methodical way.
Okay. No, thank you so much for that insight.
Mhm.
I'm joking here a little bit, but I like to think maybe I contributed a little bit to brand awareness in the United States because I did have a soccer jersey with a JD Sports sponsor on the sleeve. So
Nah,
inadvertently helping
okay.
you guys out there.
Harvey, every little
But,
bit counts. I'm telling you, when we see the JD bags like out in the wild, because in the UK it's a big thing. It's just
yeah,
everywhere. When you see them in the US, I still to this day, even though I'm no longer with the company, I still feel a little bit of pride kind of shoot through me.
yeah.
So thank you for your effort there.
Of course. Awesome. Well, I'd like to thank you once again just so much for spending time with us and sharing your insights from your experiences, Ariane. Really appreciated it. And to me, I feel like I've learned so much. I hope the folks who are on the webinar as well feel the same way. Thank you again to the audience members who shared the questions with us. For anyone who's looking to learn more, we do encourage you to take a look at the resources section of our website. And if you miss part of this webinar, you can access this on demand as part of our events page as well. So keep an eye out for that because we've got more good stuff coming up. So again, thank you to everyone who joined us today. And thank you again to Ariane. We wish you all the best in your new role and congratulations.
Thanks, Harvey. Thanks, everyone.
Bye.